So, what do Daryl Hall, Peter Gabriel, and Robert Fripp all have in common? Let's find out on Amity Tracks. Hey guys, welcome to Amity Tracks. Before we get started, I just want to remind people, please do subscribe to the channel. I mean, it really does help us out. It helps us do what we want to do. I want to thank everyone who has subscribed so far. It's great to have you on board. I hope you're enjoying the material, and like the videos and hit the bell for notifications and all that good stuff. All right. So what do Daryl Hall, his album Sacred Songs, recorded in 1977 but not released until 1980, Peter Gabriel's second solo album released in 1978, and Robert Fripp's Exposure released in 1979? What do they have in common? Are they connected? Well, of course they are, otherwise I wouldn't be making this video. First of all, Robert Fripp produces all three of them and plays on all three of them, but that's not enough to connect them. Now, in Fripp's mind, these three records were actually part of a loose trilogy. Now, what's interesting is I have never seen anywhere, maybe they have, but I've never seen anywhere Daryl Hall talking about that or Peter Gabriel talking about that. But in Fripp's mind, and he's talked about it, they were part of this trilogy and intended to be listened to in the order in which they were recorded and they were supposed to be released. Now, the delayed release of Hall's record kind of threw a wrench in the whole thing, but you're supposed to listen to Hall's first, then Gabriel's, and then the finale is Fripp. And as Fripp explained it, I'll read this is a quote from Robert Fripp. He says, "What I was trying to do in the original trilogy was to investigate the pop song as a means of expression. I think it's a supreme discipline to know that you have 3 or 4 minutes to get together all your lost emotions and find words of one syllable or less." A cheeky comment on the simplicity of the pop form, I think. "To put forward all your ideas. It's a discipline of form that I don't think is cheap or shoddy," says Robert Fripp. Now, how did this thing get messed up? Well, even though Daryl Hall's record was recorded first, it was released last because his management and his record company balked. They didn't want this to be put out. So I guess let's talk about this one first, because in some ways it's the most interesting. So Daryl Hall, Hall and Oates, right? Whom I love, by the way. Great pop songs, ton of hits, but in the mainstream, definitely. Well, by 1977, Daryl Hall was getting a little antsy. He wanted to kind of stretch himself a bit, uh, you know, be a little more artsy. And Robert Fripp, King Crimson had broken up again, and was on at least a long hiatus, and so Fripp was kind of a free agent. They met, hit it off, and Fripp agreed to work with Hall and produce his record. And Hall was ecstatic because Fripp had all this cachet as this artsy, experimental, progressive, kingpin, right? And Hall kind of wanted to try some of that. And it's interesting. Robert Fripp was really impressed with Daryl Hall. I have a quote here. He said, "Daryl Hall's the best singer I've ever met," which is pretty high praise, right? And Robert Fripp, and he was on record as saying this is a bit much, but saying he thought Daryl Hall had the potential to be as creative and as respected as David Bowie. That's a stretch. I love Daryl Hall. Daryl Hall's a cool dude, actually. I don't know if you ever seen his what was that? What's that show of his upstairs at Daryl's house or something? Where he has all these cool jam sessions with all this real eclectic group of musicians. I mean, he's turned out to be he's a cool guy. He really is. Hell of a singer too. I mean, you cannot deny what a great singer Daryl Hall is. But anyway, so they recorded this, and I mean, it's an interesting listen. It's definitely edgier for Daryl Hall. Kind of, he's trying to kind of get into this sort of, the beginnings of a sort of new wave, movement. And it's really funny. There's one song on here, "Urban Landscape," which is basically a Frippertronics instrumental piece with Robert Fripp just doing his guitar effects. It's like right in the middle of these still pop songs. You've got this like instrumental experimentation from Fripp. But there it is. But Hall's management and the record company didn't. They had visions of Hall having this hugely successful mainstream commercial, career, and they didn't want any sort of experimental, edgy whatever. And so they wouldn't put this out. And so Fripp and Hall kind of joined forces and went on their own publicity campaign, you know, demanding that this come out, giving copies of it to DJs so they'd start playing it. And finally, the record company gave in and put it out, but they didn't put any promotion behind it. And it just kind of, died out commercially, which is a shame because it's actually very good. It's actually very good. And so looking at these others, although actually one other thing. Now, if you remember in that quote, I had, or Fripp used the word discipline twice. That's not an accident. What happened after the recording of this was very interesting. Robert Fripp and Daryl Hall were seriously considering putting together a new band. And so it was going to be Fripp, Hall, bassist extraordinaire Tony Levin, and great drummer Jerry Marotta, who worked a lot with Peter Gabriel. Well, so did and still does Tony Levin. And so it was going to be Fripp, Hall, Levin, and Marotta. It's been a fascinating band. They were going to call it Discipline. That was going to be the name of the band. Well, things kind of unfolded. Hall went back with Oates and continued with Hall and Oates. Marotta bowed out. And so Fripp and Levin were kind of left together. And so they pulled in, Fripp's old compadre from the earlier version of King Crimson, Bill Bruford on drums, and Adrian Belew on as another guitarist and for the singer. And Belew, of course, as experimental as Fripp, and an incredible guitar player in his own right. And of course, as many of you know, that became the new '80s lineup of a newly formed King Crimson, and their first album was entitled Discipline. And so that's how all that kind of happened and unfolded. All right. We can talk briefly about Peter Gabriel's second record. Now, this record does kind of get lost sometimes in between his excellent debut and groundbreaking third record. And I don't think this reaches the same heights as those two records, although it's still very interesting, intriguing. And it is interesting to have Robert Fripp play such a big role in it. On the Air is a great opener, rocking song actually. DIY is cool. Mother of Violence is beautiful, really stark, stripped down. I wish Gabriel would do more of that. With great piano from Roy Bittan, and of course Exposure, which is the title track of Robert Fripp's record, is also on here with that killer bass work from Tony Levin. Gosh, good. Yeah, so it's interesting. Now Fripp's record, it's interesting. We talked about Hall, Fripp giving Hall this sort of edge. Well, with the same token, Fripp sort of comes back from his usual edge and tries to work within sort of the new wave kind of pop song format, but it's still Robert Fripp, so it's still really strange and still has an edge. And then he also, kind of sprinkles in, his instrumental experimentations amongst all these songs. And the song Urban Landscape, which was on Hall's record, reappears here. So there's this overlap with these records. And what was interesting too is Daryl Hall was supposed to sing like on all these tracks. And Hall's management again balked and said, well, then this needs to be credited to, Daryl Hall and Robert Fripp. Well, Fripp didn't want to have a co-credit on there. I mean, nothing against Hall, but this was his record, right? And so Hall's vocals actually only remain on two songs on this. You Burn Me Up, I'm a Cigarette, and North Star. And then the rest of the songs, he got other people to come in and lay vocals. Peter Hamill, and I don't know how to say the name, but Terra Roche, I think. Anyway, um, and so Hall's role on this is greatly diminished from what it was intended to be. So that's kind of those three records. Now, there is a 3 CD deluxe set of Fripps Exposure. Typical of Fripp, he gets a lot of detail. There's like 3 different versions of this record. And what's kind of cool is you can sort of mix and match, of which tracks you like the best, and sort of make your own exposure, And for instance, if you want to hear what that, with Daryl Hall on all these, sprinkled on all 3 of those CDs, and you can kind of put them together. And I've burned my own version of it. You can create a record with Hall on all the vocals on Fripps, and it's kind of hear what that would have sounded like. It's very interesting. It gives Daryl Hall an even more of an edge than Sacred Songs, right? But this is worthwhile. This is worthwhile. Yeah. Now Fripp has since, he kind of downplayed the connection here. I think, because it kind of failed. And, he is now considers this as part of the connective tissue of some of his own records leading into 80s Crimson. But I kind of like the idea of these being in this loose trilogy. And it's sort of fun to listen to. And you can, again, you can pull out the connections if you want to. I kind of wrote down here some of the overlap. You've got, so New York City, New York on Hall's record was retitled I May Not Have Had Enough of Me, but I've Had Enough of You on Fripp's record. Some of the lyrics were changed a little bit, and obviously the vocalist is different. Exposure is on both Fripp and Gabriel's record. Now, Gabriel's song Here Comes the Flood, which was on his first record, Gabriel's never been happy with. He thinks that was overproduced and kind of too bombastic. I love it, but if you listen to how he has performed it since then, he's really stripped it down. Sometimes just solo, piano with it. It's beautiful in the newer version, and that stripped down version reappears here with Gabriel on vocals on Fripps Exposure. So that's kind of cool. We talked about the 2 songs that Daryl Hall still sings on Exposure. Fripp's Urban Landscape, that instrumental, is also on Exposure, as well as Hall's Sacred Songs. And of course, Fripp is playing and producing on all 3 records. So, it's an interesting story. How good are they? I think they're all great. I mean, Daryl Hall's record is very interesting. Again, it's not what you're really used to from Daryl Hall. It's a little more edge to it, but it's still, still trying to work within the pop song format. Like Peter Gabriel's Peter Gabriel. And, while this might not be one of his greatest solo records, it's still very good and very interesting. And Robert Fripp's Exposure is really good. So again, sort of edgier new wave, and in some ways it is kind of a precursor to what, 80s, that trilogy of records from King Crimson in the 80s when they were the quartet, sort of what they were really trying to do. It's an interesting precursor to that. So, yeah, if you're interested, I'd check all 3 of them out. Well, anyway, I hope that was interesting to me. So we'll see you next time on Amity Tracks.